from 0 to 4 in particular, we are extremely vulnerable because we actually are not able to process anything rationally. Everything is taken at face value because our brain is only developing. Things can get very muddled up and very complicated for a little child, because essentially they know that there's something that is making them feel bad, but they don't fully understand it. And really, they have no capacity to make sense of it. And what that can result in is that by the age of 4, actually, and that happens to probably most people. So I want people to think that this is not abnormal. This is kind of normal. There is a lot of things that can happen to a child that can traumatize it. And we're not talking major traumas. We're sometimes talking little things, like being licked by a puppy, maybe a really nice experience for one child and maybe completely traumatic for another, right? So we're not talking necessarily about the event itself that matters. So it's not the event itself that matters. What matters is the internal processing and the internal perception of what is happening, right? And if, for instance, there's a lack of bonding between the primary caregivers and that child, then we will have an issue. And it's not necessarily that the parents are narcissistic or they're bad people or they want that child to be harmed. No. I'm talking, this is like a normal family. Everybody wants the best for the child, right? And this can still happen. Because if we have a situation where a parent, for instance, they work 2 jobs to make ends meet, they're really busy, maybe they're struggling emotionally because they have their own unresolved trauma. What can happen is a child needs a lot of emotional support at that point and needs a lot of emotional nurturing and reassurance. It's not enough to just feed your child. That emotional nurturing is just as important. What can happen is child comes to mommy for a cuddle and mommy goes, darling, I'm tired, and she just is not interested or whatever, right? That event alone can produce such bad internal response that this child will conclude that there's something wrong with them and the mommy doesn't love them. And if that takes place regularly, maybe the parent is not that tactile, maybe they're not comfortable with touch and cuddling, for instance, so they're not necessarily a bad person. Then if we have this regular occurrence whereby this child gets this feeling of mommy doesn't respond to me, or she doesn't cuddle me or kisses me, and I feel a little bit let down by that because that's what I need right now, my emotional needs, in other words, are not being met, then we will end up with this child getting this idea that somehow there's something wrong with them and they are somehow deficient and it's somehow their fault, because that is the processing that will occur at that age. Mm-hmm. The child will not be thinking, well, mommy has worked so hard today and maybe she had an argument with her boss and that's maybe the reason why she's not being too responsive. A child won't think like that. A child will take everything personally, internalize it, and then conclude that it's them. It is them so we then have a problem because we have the beginnings. This is the seed of the not good enoughness. Not I'm not worthy. I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable. Which then, quite honestly, most of the time, what will happen is they will go into the world with that seed of this idea, and then maybe they will get teased at school. Maybe they won't get invited to a party by a friend and they get left out. Or there's something, in some way they're different and they'll get picked on or something like that. Or maybe they're not good at a subject at school and they just constantly feel like they're not good enough, right? And then maybe they'll get in a relationship and then the relationship is toxic. And again, they feel that the confidence is being knocked. And again, it feels like it's somehow their fault. And you can see how that can then go on and develop into somebody having this underlying feeling of just feeling not comfortable with themselves, not good enough, not capable, whatever you want to call it. You know, there's obviously so many different ways in which we can describe that state. Then what that will translate into, they will fear rejection, they will fear criticism, they'll probably have some issues with control. So usually it could be one or the other, or it could be both. And that's what's going to lead to all sorts of anxieties, things like social anxiety, for instance. So do you see how something really small can spark this whole cascade of, like, a domino effect, if you will, throughout a lifetime of this person? And then we've got this person who is 30, 40, 50, maybe 60. I mean, I worked with people in their 80s, right? And they still feel that they're not able to live their life fully because they're just too anxious, they're too scared, they feel that people will judge them, and so that stops them from living their lives. They will go and dwell on different things that happened in the past, because they will, for instance, they will do things like, oh, I should have said this and I should have said that. Oh, if only I reacted this way and not that way. And they will just torture themselves over things that happened in the past that they have no control over anymore because they're in the past. Or they may be projecting into a future and worrying about the things that may happen. Or what if this happens? What if that happens? What if I go to this party and people won't like me? Or if I do this presentation and they'll judge me and I will come out like I'm not knowledgeable enough and it feels like a complete failure, and so on, right? And so a lot of people, in fact, most people, you know, we often talk about how good it would be if everybody lived in the moment. Well, they don't. People don't tend to live in the moment. People tend to either dwell on the past or worry about the future. And that's where people spend most of their time, which obviously means that this is that low underlying level of stress that I was referring to earlier. And that's toxic. That's toxic to the mind and that's toxic to the body because of the connection, the nervous system connection. So it is complicated and people do get overwhelmed and people do get confused. And this is just, so what I was talking about there is potentially some attachment trauma. So when we're talking about trauma, we cannot just think of trauma as PTSD, because in a lot of ways, PTSD is actually faster and easier to resolve than attachment trauma. They both can be resolved, by the way. But people tend to think that the worst type of trauma is PTSD trauma. And that's actually, from me, from working with this for a long, long time, I don't actually agree. I mean, PTSD is serious and people really suffer. I'm not minimizing that in any way, but it's usually a one-off event that causes that trauma. It's a very clear-cut thing. Usually when people end up with PTSD, they're very, very clear on what it is that caused them to have this PTSD. And as such, because we've got a very clear idea, we can go after that and fix that reasonably easily. But what about all those people who have loads of fear, loads of anxieties, constant guilt, constant shame, not feeling good enough, and you ask them about trauma and they go, I can't think of anything. I just can't think of anything. Nothing bad really happened to me. But usually what that means is there was probably a level of either emotional neglect, because obviously that can happen in those early years, like I was describing, particularly 0 to 4. I mean, it can obviously be slightly later as well, but that's the most vulnerable time. Or the parents were loving and caring, but they were just not emotionally nurturing enough, and that child needed that emotional nurturing. So as a result of that, it developed this pattern of sort of thinking about themselves and the world as something like it's always me, so everybody is okay, but I'm not okay, and it's always me, and I'm the one who's deficient, I'm the one who's inadequate, I'm the one who's not good enough, and so on. And then, of course, that shapes the whole belief system. So everything they believe about themselves and about the world is determined by those early years, right? So it could be positive, but most of the time it's not. It's quite negative. And of course, we live our lives according to our values and beliefs, and so it goes on.